morning. I'd like to call to order the March 10th, 2020 New York State Hearing Aid Dispensing Advisory Board. Good morning, everyone. So, I'd like to start introductions. Albany.
Allison Lacey, Bureau of Educational Standards.
Emily Loopy, Department of State. Mary Jo Moore, Department of State.
Amy Mezzadine, State.
Dave Mossberg, Department of State.
Jason Education, State Education Department.
Mark Massimino, Department of State.
Denise Tidings, Department of State.
New York City.
Anthony Massera, Dispensing Audiologist and Board Member.
Janessa Shapiro, Dispensing Audiologist and Board Member.
Anita Gant, Department of State.
Ernest Delaney, Department of State.
Jerry Bergman, Consumer Representative on the board.
Okay, and our Buffalo office.
Ann Orsini, Dispensing Audiology, just a board member.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Dave, do we have a quorum?
No, we do not.
Okay, we do not have a quorum today. So, before we begin, I would just like everybody to remind everybody just to state their name for the cart service provider prior to speaking. Thank you very much. So I'm going to start with the department subcommittee reports. Approval of, we're going to have to skip number 1 because we don't have a quorum to approve the meeting summary from the last meeting. Next, we'll go to enforcement report. Ernita?
Ernest will be giving the report today.
Okay.
Okay, so Ernest Delaney, here's the enforcement report for the Hearing Aid Dispenser Board. Since our last board meeting on September 9th, 2019, we have received a total of 5 new complaints. Over that same time period, we have closed 3 complaints. The ones that were closed, 2 were closed due to no violation, and 1 was closed with a warning. And our current caseload is 13 cases. When we consider the cases that we have received and completed the investigation on, they concern issues of allegations that the dispenser was identifying him or her as himself as a doctor in the advertising, and that the dispenser refused to sign paperwork that the client felt was needed. Okay. Are there any questions?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ernest.
Thank you.
Next on the agenda is the processing report. Emily Loopy.
Hi, this is Emily Loopy. In your folder, you will find licensing statistics for 2019 and 2020. The report shows the number of hearing aid businesses broken down by business list broken down by class code or license type, and a report of hearing aid dispensers broken down by type and by county. The numbers between the 2 years are fairly consistent. If you're interested in reviewing this information, the reports are available in your meeting folder. Any questions?
Any questions for Emily? Okay. Thank you, Emily. Next on the agenda is the education examination report by Allison. Please.
Hello, morning. This is Allison Lacey. I'm first going to give the examination report. I'm going to give the examination statistics for the year 2019. 67 written exams were administered statewide with a 66% passing rate. 44 ear mold practical exams were administered statewide.
Sorry. New York City, can you mute? You can hit a shuffle for the paper.
Okay.
This?
Yes, can we mute it?
Yeah.
I think I'm sorry, Allison. Okay, thanks so much. Go ahead, Allison.
Okay. 44 ear mold practical exams were administered statewide with a 98% passing rate, and 50 audiometric practical exams were administered statewide with an 88% passing rate. There has been no written or practical exam changes this year. Next, I'm going to report on education. The Bureau of Educational Standards continues to audit hearing aid dispenser renewals. Those renewals which do not indicate approval code numbers or do not appear to include T-coil infection control and New York State and federal law, in addition to the balance of required hours, are not processed and sent to the Bureau for an educational compliance audit. A renewal license will only be granted when satisfactory proof of education is provided. To date, 29 licensees have been audited and 17 have complied. Of the 12 non-complied, most are within the time frame to respond, and only 3 were found to be missing 1 or more of the required hours. Course availability still appears to be adequate, and it has not been an issue raised by our licensees. Are there any questions?
Okay. Thank you, Allison. We're going to move through now down to action items. The OTC Subcommittee report. Ann?
Good morning, everyone. So the OTC Subcommittee met on January 29th of 2020 to discuss the Over-the-Counter Hearing Aid Act of 2017. The FDA was supposed to have issued its first proposed rules by November 2019 and finalized the rule within 180 days after the close of a 120-day comment period. So this subcommittee was established to discuss the proposed FDA regulations relating to the sale of OTC hearing aids and their potential effects on licensed dispensers and consumers in New York State. Unfortunately, the proposed rules have not been released yet by the FDA, likely due to more pressing matters in the country at this time. I will inform the Department of State when the regulations do become available. So at the meeting, the subcommittee will review the regulations and will meet within 2 weeks of the release to discuss. So once they're released, the subcommittee will review, and then we decided it was important that we meet as soon as possible within 2 weeks so that we can discuss them. So part of this process includes that the FDA is looking for feedback to help ensure that there's enough safeguards in place for consumers purchasing these over-the-counter devices. And it was suggested at the subcommittee meeting that the advisory board provide a response to the initial rules and disseminate it to the licensees in New York State so we could weigh in during the 120-day response period. However, our New York State Licensing Council mentioned that it would not be appropriate to solicit licensees or for the board to take a position on legal issues. Instead, it was suggested that members look to our professional organizations to seek out and take into consideration what type of comments and positions were being made by our professional organizations. So the federal regulations that come out will supersede and may affect New York State hearing aid dispensing laws and regulations, necessitating both statutory and regulatory amendments. Hearing aid definitions will need to cover OTCs as they will be considered medical devices under the FDA. The FDA regulations will define the differences between OTCs, traditional hearing aids, and more than likely PSAPs. So the subcommittee discussed the need to develop education materials and make them available for licensees and consumers in New York State to ensure that everyone is aware of the differences between OTCs and traditional hearing aids, so that consumers can make an informed choice and that the licensed professionals give appropriate information to their patients regarding OTCs. So after a lengthy discussion, the subcommittee agreed that we will likely need to take action in the following areas, which are making statutory and regulatory amendments, managing consumer expectations. Most likely we'll need to update the consumer brochure. We discussed potentially the need for updating the hearing aid dispensing syllabus and exams, and we need to think about continuing education considerations, that they're included in that coursework that's provided. We also talked about the need for having a New York State Education Department representative involved in this process. And once again, you know, the hearing aid dispensing law booklet, the hearing aid guide, and consumer guide will all likely need revisions. And we need to ensure that all licensed hearing aid dispensers in New York State are aware of all of these changes. So nothing's come yet from the FDA. Hopefully we'll have more information by the next scheduled New York State board meeting for May 28th. But at this point, there's nothing to discuss because the initial regulations have not yet been put out. Any comments? Okay,
Thank
that's
you,
it.
Ann. That was a great report, and it sounds as though you have some really good ideas how to move forward once the regulations have been established, which is important. So, thanks very much for that. So the next action item is Veterans Mobility Safety Act of 2016, Fit to Serve Bill. Dave Mossberg.
Thank you. So at our last board meeting, one of the board members brought to our attention a requirement with respect to fitting aids for veterans, and asked about a requirement that it be signed off and whether or not the department could do anything to ease the burden on veterans receiving these devices and being treated by dispensers. At that time, I indicated that it was my belief that I thought that this was potentially governed by federal act, and therefore it'd be unlikely that we would, as an agency, be able to do anything to change those requirements. So after the meeting, I looked into it a little bit further, and in every board package, there should be a printout regarding the Veterans Mobility Safety Act. It was something that we pulled off, obviously, after the board meeting. And in the legislation, in the federal legislation, there's a note with respect to the federal law that specifically says that the secretary, and this is referring to the federal, shall ensure, for reference, I'm referring to page 4 of 5, sort of in the middle of the paragraph, note B to 38 United States Code section 7401. Paragraph 2 of it specifies that the secretary shall ensure that the services provided to veterans by hearing aid specialists shall be provided as part of the non-medical treatment plan developed by an audiologist. Because the federal act uses the term shall, I don't believe that we would be able to change those requirements to avoid the plan or the sign-off from a licensed audiologist. So the dispenser, can continue to dispense pursuant to paragraph 1, but according to this, it shall be as part of the plan developed by an audiologist. So that was sort of the research that I did into that question. I don't know if anyone has any questions. I believe Eric Freeman was the board member that asked that question. So, obviously we could fill them in later, but that's sort of the research or the opinion that I have at this time.
Any questions? Thank you, Dave. The next item is the board member contact information update by Denise Tidings.
Denise Tidings. In your folder, there are 2 new lists of the board member contact information. They've both been updated. The second one is the one that has been updated online, and it's now available with the updated meeting summaries from the March 25th and September 9th, 2019 meeting summaries. That can all be found online, and if you have any changes in the future to your contact information, please let me know. That's it.
Thanks, Denise. Next on the agenda is new business, the closed caption law. Dave?
Okay. So at our last meeting, Jerry had mentioned to the board a revision to the state civil rights law regarding closed captioning. And there were some questions regarding, what the law said and when it went into effect. So in following up on that, in everyone's package or folder, there should be a double-sided printout of revised New York Civil Rights Law, Section 79-0. The section itself is entitled Closed Captioning in Places of Public Accommodation, Resort, or Amusement. As Jerry mentioned, what this law basically requires are that places of public accommodation, resort, or amusement, as defined elsewhere in the New York Executive Law, Section 292, shall upon request be required to have closed captioning enabled on the televisions in a public area during the regular business hours. There are some exemptions. First is if there are no televisions, obviously they don't have to put closed captioning. And then also if there are two televisions that are displaying the same broadcast simultaneously, apparently only one of them will have to have the closed captioning, not all of them in the area. And related to this, after the last meeting, and again, this was something that I know that the board has spoken about previously, Amy Penzabine and I, we had a conversation with a representative from the Division of Human Rights. We had requested, that they send somebody to our board meeting so that they can explain sort of their role in potentially enforcing some of these provisions that benefit the persons, most likely to rely on the board, and also those that the Department of State licenses. And so this was one of the provisions that we mentioned to them, also about, outreach and education with respect to looping technologies and things of that nature. And so, unfortunately, because of scheduling, the DHR rep wasn't able to come to this board meeting. But we're hoping that with enough advance notice, we could have the rep at our next board meeting. And I mention that in this context because this law potentially could be something that the Division of Human Rights may enforce or look into. This isn't really the Department of State's jurisdiction, so I don't want to speak too much upon this. However, the first sentence of the new provision says that it's a public accommodation, resort, or amusement as defined under the executive law. That section of the executive law is generally known as the human rights law, whereas this statute, this new law that was signed, is under the civil rights law. So the Division of Human Rights enforces the human rights law. This provision is under the civil rights law. So there's some overlapping jurisdiction, but I think it's best to allow DHR to go into more specifics with respect to any sort of enforcement or application or meaning of this law. This really doesn't impact specific board duties because this isn't something that's under the general business law, but it is relevant and is certainly important. So certainly thank Jerry for bringing it to our attention. The only other thing that I would note with respect to this provision is that it doesn't go into effect until July 1st of this year. So really there's an opportunity for, potential awareness from the public in the next coming months, but at this point, the law is not yet effective. So I don't know if anyone has any questions. Again, the law is in everyone's folders. If anyone has questions, feel free to let me know.
Thank you. This is Jerry Bergman in New York City. Thank you, Dave, for following up and that excellent review of how the law shapes up. I just want everybody to have a little more background. Apparently, to the best of my knowledge, this law was adopted last year without the involvement of the Hearing Loss Association, New York State. When I actually took a look at the legislation, such as you've given us in our packets, I was disturbed, to say the least, to see that the requirement for captioning is only if a patron requests it. Like so much of what's wrong with the human rights afforded to people with hearing loss, this is another case of where the person with the disability has to go out of their way to get what should be their right under the law. And we know because so many people with hearing loss feel stigma or are elderly or simply do not wish to make trouble, in quotes, it's not likely that many of them will do anything. Moreover, if they do, let's say they're in a noisy restaurant, the waiter is a part-time actor, and you say to the waiter, can you have somebody put the captions on the television, please? The waiter's likely to say, what are you talking about? You know, I take food orders. It's not likely that many people at all in these establishments will be familiar with this law. There's another issue, which is that it's disappointing that the issue of noise in places of public accommodation is not at all addressed. What the law should have said is establishments must put on closed captions and must also turn the sound off, because people don't go to a bar for the most part to watch television, and even if they did, they could read the captions without making it harder for people with hearing loss to hear by leaving the sound on. Bottom line, New York City has already developed a draft bill to supersede the state requirement to make it mandatory that establishments provide the captioning on their televisions. And we're going to follow that, and hopefully when that's adopted, we will seek a similar change to the state ordinance. Thank you. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Jerry. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is the 2020 Advisory Board.
Denise Tidings. As you know, the next board meeting is scheduled for Thursday, May 28th at 1 p.m. I was able to get a hold of the DHR representative, and he is available for that meeting. So we should be able to have him here for that one.
Thanks, Denise. So now I'll go to public comment period. We'll start in Albany. Does anybody in Albany like to speak?
Okay, and I go from here, do I have, is this a mic situation?
I think you probably should go in front of the TV. But you don't need to use a mic.
Just come closer.
Yeah, I think that you probably should be seen through the webcast.
Can Jerry hear me? Jerry, can you hear me talking? This is Fred.
Yes,
Fred
I
Goose.
can. Fred, thank you. Nice to hear from you.
Thank you, too. I can hear you well, too, Jerry. Just want you to know that. A couple of quick things. we're, first of all, the Hearing Healthcare Alliance of New York is holding their program coming up in May in Saratoga. We will have 11 and a half hours approved by the department, including the 3 required accounts. We do that every year. We are having some discussions, getting that all together. Mark, you guys have been a great help, as you always are. Got nothing else to do in your department. I realize that we're the only people in the world, but what the hell. A couple comments that we'd like to make. One is which has to do with our current crisis. We will be preparing, Hearing Healthcare Alliance of New York will be preparing a document to be sent around to all of our members relating to what a hearing aid dispensing office can do in this situation if a client comes in, a potential client comes in. It's being prepared by a fellow named Joe Vespi, who is, for the last 20 years, represented a company called Hal Hen. They are the resource for hearing aid infection control items in this state. And he will be preparing it for us. Now, this is a suggestion. It will be stated that way. It will have it will have a disclaimer that any state regulations are involved with this. I'm merely telling an office what are the best things you might do to make this better. I would love to send it to more people than just our members. It will be a court introduced in the course in May 28th in Saratoga. We'll be running it there. But getting access to a larger mailing list, we can talk about that another time. But that's a provision here. The bill for closed captioning, we have some concerns about. We think it's great. It's the beginning of things that are right, including, but may lead into the looping discussion we come later in the program. So looking forward to that. OTC, I noticed in the report that was given by Dave that the professional organizations were mentioned, making comments. We have not been contacted. I wonder if the Department of State is considering contacting us for positions and so forth in that area.
Just to clarify, I didn't give the report on OTC, and as I understood it, as Ann was explaining, it was so that any members of the public that wish to comment on federal legislation,
okay.
But during the subcommittee, there was a question of whether or not the state of New York would take an official position on the federal provision. I was explaining that in the usual course, it's not something that the agency traditionally does, which is to comment on federal legislation. However, any members of the public that wanted to could certainly reach out through their professional organizations or even individual capacity if they wanted to comment on federal law. So the Department of State wouldn't solicit any organization or individual to provide their own comment on it.
I understand that the OTC foregoes any changes by the states in their what's coming out. That was stated in the document. But there are also some things that we feel could be enacted that will not interfere with the OTC law, such as consumer education, which makes great sense, such as being sure that anyone who approaches one of these sales locations is told at the location what they are buying and what they are not buying. I think in those kinds of things, just the information distribution without making recommendations, and we would love to be involved in that. So that we fear two things. First, people are going to buy these hearing aids. They're not going to do what they expected them to do. They have very limited capabilities, and they will stop using them, and they'll walk away from hearing help altogether. Because if they're called hearing aids, they'll think no hearing aids work. The second, without an evaluation by a dispenser or dispensing audiologist to discover any of the 8 flags, looking for cerumen, looking for indicators of medically correctable situations, there might be a great deal of medical situations which are go unreported because the person doesn't have to have that exam. I'm not stating that dispensers and audiologists give medical evaluations, but we are we are required to make otoscopic observations as well as questionable observations, which may indicate the existence of, and that goes along with the fact that the waiver provision is still in effect in New York State. So we're concerned about that. I think that's it. But otherwise, I think it's a great meeting. I don't have to listen to Eric Freeman because he'll yell at me when it's all done. But thank you. And also, we will be letting you know if any board member wishes to come to Saratoga on the 20th and 29th to see how do we educate these people. We will be giving 11 and a half hours. How does it work? And that will also help some of you who have to prove the courses so you can see what we mean by these courses. What are we delivering? Because I think we are the only location in New York State where an individual can go to get 50% of their CEs each year in one event. And all of our members come twice, one this year, next year, they're covered. And we've also been sending back to, and I hope it's okay, our certificates of completion, which indicate courses, course numbers, course hour, location, and names us because we are an approved educational provider. And I think that has helped out because we're supposed to get 20 names into 5 spaces on the program. But I hope that's okay with you guys. We said that I think that trying to help you get this through because I realize that you guys are very, we appreciate that. We done? Good.
Thank you, Fred.
Thank you.
Okay, is there anybody in the New York City office that wants to speak?
This is Jerry, just in response to Fred's comments. I have a question, Fred. Is there a position of your organization with respect to your members selling these over-the-counter products or steering clear of that?
And at this point, Jerry, we have no official position. I cannot talk about that. Our board will be meeting in May when we find out what exactly is going. I would hope that these things are reviewed, looked at, possibly offered by a hearing aid dispensing office, because that way at least we know what they're doing and what the client is doing, but in the same format as is currently required of testing, questioning, and so forth, which although at the storefront doesn't need to be done, but if we did it, we would do it in the way that we are required by law. So I think the client would know exactly what they're getting and exactly what they need at that point.
Can I add a comment? I think that's the reason why we wanted the subcommittee, is because until they actually come out with real wording, we have no way. We're just speculating and, saying that they might not be adequate for an individual, may not necessarily be true because, again, we don't know what the FDA is going to say. But the fact that we are already having that conversation and just waiting to know is a step ahead, which was the goal, to be a step ahead, not a step behind. And the other aspect of it is the fact that we learned in the subcommittee, as Anne mentioned, that we cannot have a say, or we have to ask for permission to have a say, is the way I took that. The fact that we have different organizations that will be willing to have a public comment is also really helpful. So, everyone happens to know a lot of people, and everyone will be reading this FDA ruling when it does come out. And I'm sure that different organizations within New York State, such as the Hearing Loss Association and the Hearing Aid Dispensers and New York State Speech and Hearing Association, that a lot of us are part of, we will be more than happy to contribute to kind of one voice and hopefully work together. So let's all wait on what the FDA will say, I guess.
Just a follow-up comment, this is Jerry. Our Hearing Loss Association of America got behind the OTC bill largely because of the expectation that that the availability of those products would draw more people into hearing healthcare, the system. And so I think to the extent that that first contact can be through licensed dispensers, I think that's a good thing. And so, you know, we would like to see that happen in New York State.
Jerry, comment on that. There's nothing preventing a licensed, or in our case, registered hearing aid dispenser or dispensing audiologist from offering these devices, because they will be declared as hearing help devices, so it's already there. We don't have to be included in the OTC bill, because if we did it, it'd be done in accordance with state and federal law. And naturally, we're considering that. Before I go off, one last point on FTC. The Fit to Serve bill has been in place, as you know. The intention was that veterans, the VA excluded licensed, registered hearing aid dispensers from conducting tests or helping dispense hearing aids. A licensed or registered hearing aid dispenser prior to Fit to Serve was only allowed to maybe clean a hearing aid, mail a hearing, but nothing that we are trained to do in every state. This is an attempt to open that up, because the audiologists do services that go levels above this, and we felt that they should be free to work with the ENTs for some of the medical considerations, which are not in our purview. But the VA's been dragging its feet, as is obvious. There is a bill in the United States in the Senate Bill number 785 in Washington, which basically require the VA. I'll give you the information. We require the VA to act within 100 days, establish qualifications for hearing aid specialists who work for the VA, and also require that they be there to free up. And I'll give you some reference to this, David. It has not been passed. It's in the Senate, and I think it's going to work.
Okay, thank you. Is there anybody in Buffalo that would like to speak?
No.
Okay. All right. So that concludes our meeting. I would like to call for a motion to adjourn. Anybody?
Second that.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. That concludes our this hearing aid board meeting. Have a good day. See you guys May 28th.